The discussion today centers on, well, one of the most astonishing recent developments in transatlantic security. The unprecedented inclusion of the United States as a negative factor and a source of growing uncertainty in the Danish Defense Intelligence Service, the FE, Annual Threat Assessment. And this is so remarkable because the U.S. is, at the same time, correctly described by the Danes as their closest ally and the indispensable guarantor of European security.
It is. It's a profound piece of strategic communication, and one that forces us to analyze, precisely what the Danes believe they are communicating and who they're communicating it to. This isn't just some quiet, bureaucratic update. It's an international incident in the making.
Exactly. The central tension is just unavoidable. Is this report, listing the U.S. as a threat, a necessary and sobering strategic reevaluation of U.S. dependability in a world the FDF itself calls a jungle law environment, or is it primarily a calculated political signal, one designed to manage some highly consequential U.S. pressure and mobilize support for Danish and European sovereignty? I'm going to argue that this is fundamentally a necessary strategic reevaluation based on clear, observable policy shifts from Washington.
And I'll maintain that while you can't ignore the strategic context, its inclusion is primarily a calculated political signal. They're using the intelligence framework as a powerful lever to maximize Copenhagen's position, especially on finance and the Arctic, without, sacrificing that core defense partnership.
I see why you think that, but let me offer a different perspective. The FE's decision to formally list its main ally as a source of uncertainty is, I think, a non-negotiable strategic necessity. It reflects observable, even hostile policy shifts from Washington. You just can't dismiss the report's explicit philosophical framing here. The FE states, and this is a quote, that the world now resembles more jungle law than a rules-based international order. When a small nation like Denmark recognizes this, it is compelled, really, to adjust its security planning to account for risks coming even from close partners. So the threat is structural, not just transient. The U.S. is identified as using its economic and technological strength as a power instrument, using sanctions and export controls to enforce its will on allies. And crucially, the report observes that the U.S. no longer rules out using military force even against partners. When core principles, things like national borders, sovereignty of states, territorial integrity, which are anchored in the UN Charter, when those are challenged by your main ally, as we've seen with the recurring threat to annex Greenland, while strategic hedging moves from being optional to being mandatory, this is a cold assessment of a shifted reality, not a political talking point.
I'd come at it from a different angle. While the strategic context is, without a doubt, complex, formal inclusion in a public threat assessment is just about the most powerful political statement an allied nation can make, short of, withdrawal. If this were purely a deep strategic break because of some existential threat, the language from the intelligence director would be far less equivocal. The FE director, Thomas Ehrenkiel, he took great pains to balance the negative assessment. He simultaneously stressed the U.S. remains the closest partner and ally and the guarantor of Europe's security. That delicate juxtaposition tells us this is fundamentally about leverage and perception management. The report serves to openly acknowledge the U.S. threat, which lets them talk publicly about U.S. overreach, and that in turn justifies Denmark's massive and simultaneous decision to increase its own defense spending. We're talking about new funds of over DKK 14 billion. That's roughly $2 billion US dollars, specifically for Arctic defense, for new ships and long-range drones. This move is designed to satisfy the U.S. demand for more burden sharing, but it also gives Copenhagen political cover to resist these highly consequential U.S. demands, like the so-called Hague Commitment for NATO allies to spend 5% of GDP on defense. And it pointedly counters the U.S. administration's explicit goal right there in the November 2025 National Security Strategy of cultivating resistance within Europe. This is high-level signaling, not strategic isolation.
That's a compelling argument, but let's look at the hierarchy of threats for a moment. We have to remember that the primary immediate military threat to Denmark is still Russia. The FE report reiterates Russia as the primary driver of the heightened threat level.
It poses an immediate high risk of sabotage and hybrid operations against critical infrastructure. That is the existential military concern right now. If Denmark really viewed the U.S. as an equivalent strategic threat, the U.S. would not still be defined as the guarantor of Europe's security. The language, it feels like a carefully calibrated political pressure valve, a way to address political and economic volatility from Washington without actually jeopardizing the core defense agreement, the 1951 U.S.-Denmark agreement, which is still very much in force and vital for deterring Moscow.
I'm not convinced that focusing on the immediate Russian threat fully captures the Danish dilemma. I agree Russia is the immediate military threat, but the U.S. threat is structural. It's about the very foundation upon which Danish security is built. The NSS that was published in November 2025, it contains a fundamental philosophical rejection of the post-World War II partnership model that Denmark and Europe have relied on for decades. It's not just politically volatile, it is structurally hostile to existing alliance norms. The NSS prioritizes America first and warns against global and in some cases even regional domination of others, which is a thinly veiled critique targeting European integration and the EU.
When Washington officially states that they are at odds with European officials who hold unrealistic expectations for the war in Ukraine, a war on Europe's border, and then claims Europe is facing civilizational erasure from migration and a loss of national identities, this is strategic hostility. This isn't just commentary. This is the NSS calling for internal division in Europe. So Denmark cannot simply dismiss the NSS's call to cultivate resistance within European nations. When your ally formally advocates for your internal division, for the destruction of your shared values, the foundation of the relationship is strategically broken. Regardless of whether a 1951 agreement is still on paper, the strategic necessity is hedging against the partner who is actively trying to undermine you. And nowhere is this strategic necessity clearer than with the Arctic and Greenland.
This move in the FE report is absolutely essential to reassert sovereignty against a direct and recurring threat. Greenland is strategically indispensable for Washington. It hosts the Pituffik Space Base, which is vital for U.S. homeland defense. The continued rhetoric from the administration, specifically about control over Greenland, it expresses a strong belief that dominion will be realized through annexation. Prime Minister Frederiksen herself said that when your closest ally demands to take over Danish territory and meets you with pressure and threats, it fundamentally shifts the relationship. The decision to formalize this threat is rooted in the reality that the U.S. military need for Pituffik seems to override diplomatic norms in Washington's thinking. Denmark responded by invoking international law, insisting, and I'm quoting here, "You cannot annex another country, not even with an argument about international security." When an ally attacks the very idea of national borders and territorial integrity, principles anchored in the UN Charter, that requires a defensive strategic necessity. It has to be formalized in the threat assessment to justify the resources you need to defend it.
Okay, I see why you characterize the Greenland threat as existential, but the practical reality is Denmark has managed this pressure by actually deepening military integration while providing political pushback through this assessment. If Denmark truly saw the U.S. as a potential invader, as you suggest the strategic assessment dictates, we just wouldn't see the simultaneous military acceleration of U.S. access. Denmark recently launched its new fleet plan, including that 14 billion kroner investment for new Arctic capabilities. And while those measures bolster Danish independence, the new Danish defense plan also explicitly includes a pathway for U.S. forces to flow through Denmark to Eastern Europe. More significantly, the Danish parliament approved an agreement giving the U.S. access to Danish bases, including in Greenland, with a large cross-party majority. So listing the U.S. as a threat at the same time as you approve this deeper military access, well, that is the essence of a political signal. It tells Washington that cooperation is contingent on respecting sovereignty, and they are using the formal fee report as high-stakes leverage. They're managing the risk by increasing their own capabilities and integrating the U.S. on their own terms, turning the threat assessment into a bargaining chip. And if the strategic assessment has to account for military and territorial threats, then we have to consider the invisible pressure points too: economic coercion and intelligence warfare. This is where the political signaling becomes, I think, paramount. The inclusion of the U.S. in the threat assessment may be designed mainly to mitigate past damage and preempt future espionage, giving the government the diplomatic cover it needs. We know the Danish Defense Intelligence Service itself has been at the center of controversy. They were caught illegally conducting electronic investigations against people in Denmark and cooperating with the NSA using the infamous X-Key score program. That's the global NSA surveillance program the FI was caught illegally cooperating with, even using it to spy on its own government ministries, including the Foreign Ministry and the Finance Ministry. So listing the U.S. now gives the Danish government a formal defensive basis to curb excessive intelligence cooperation or to restrict access to advanced tech and data. And this becomes essential given the NSS priority on U.S. economic dominance and the explicit threat of U.S. tariffs to combat EU digital regulations, like the Digital Services Act. It's intelligence and economic self-protection being implemented under the guise of a national security assessment.
That's an interesting point about internal intelligence management, though. I would frame it a bit differently. While past scandals like X-Key scores certainly provide the necessary political cover to tighten up security protocols, I am not convinced that the primary driver here is historical intelligence management. It's about responding to direct, current economic warfare that the U.S. has openly declared. This is not about cleaning up old messes. It's about responding to a future systemic risk. The strategic context here, it centers on technology access and control over supply chains. The NSS clearly states U.S. policy will be pro-American worker and insists on reshoring industrial production via the strategic use of tariffs. This means that trade is explicitly being weaponized. The NSS warns that if European countries use discriminatory digital rules like the DSA, the U.S. will impose substantial additional tariffs and restrict tech access. The practical implication for Danish industry is severe. Danish companies rely on key U.S. technological components. If Washington strategically restricts access to those components or imposes tariffs to combat EU regulation, Denmark's national supply chains and economic security are directly and immediately threatened by its ally. The FE report simply formalizes this environment where Washington is now openly leveraging trade and technology against its European partners for U.S. domestic gain. If your closest ally uses coercive economic power as a matter of official strategy, a security reassessment isn't optional. It's unavoidable.
But if that economic coercion is the core driver, then that strengthens the argument for political signaling, doesn't it? If the U.S. is using the threat of tariffs and trade restrictions to force policy changes in Copenhagen and Brussels, then Copenhagen's most effective response is a formal, high-profile countermove. By listing the U.S. in the threat assessment, Denmark can tell the U.S., and maybe more importantly, its own domestic business constituency, that these trade threats are taken seriously and are destabilizing the alliance. This justifies domestic policies aimed at diversifying supply chains, the very thing the U.S. criticizes, without having to pull out of the defense structure. It is a carefully orchestrated negotiation conducted through intelligence reports. They are hedging, yes, but they are using the threat listing as the leverage point for those negotiations. The goal isn't separation, it's conditional cooperation.
But that conditional cooperation fundamentally proves my point about strategic reevaluation. When an ally forces you into a complex public negotiation over issues of sovereignty, economic independence, and military access, where every single act of cooperation has to be balanced by an equivalent act of political leverage, the relationship has already strategically shifted. It's moved from one based on trust and shared values to one based purely on transactional, pragmatic self-interest. Denmark is being forced to create operational capabilities, like those DKK 14 billion investments in long-range drones and satellites, that are designed to function without guaranteed U.S. support, precisely because the strategic assumption of dependability has been shattered. The necessity of that hedging proves the strategic break is real, regardless of the political wrapper it's in. So to summarize my position, the Danish threat assessment is a necessary strategic reevaluation. It's driven by the U.S. administration's documented policy choices. This includes the philosophical rejection of the rules-based order detailed in the NSS, the aggressive use of coercive economic power, and the persistent threat to national sovereignty in the Arctic.
Denmark is, in effect, forced to hedge against the political volatility and philosophical opposition coming from a key ally. The very nature of the relationship is moved from one of common destiny to one of transactional self-interest, requiring Copenhagen to bake this uncertainty right into its core defense planning.
And while I acknowledge the severe documented challenges from U.S. policies, particularly the alarming language around European integration and economic coercion, the listing of the U.S. is, I think, best understood as a sophisticated political tool. It's designed for maximization. It maximizes Danish leverage in the Arctic and within NATO. It justifies increased independent defense spending like that DKK 14 billion investment as a necessary response to an ally's volatility. Crucially, this strategy lets Denmark formally criticize Washington's conduct and reinforce a unified Danish-Greenlandic front against annexation talk, while at the same time approving deeper military access, which maintains the defense relationship it still relies on for European security against Russia. It's leverage, not divorce.
It's clear that the assessment underscores a fundamental geopolitical truth. In the current environment, the line between closest ally and strategic risk has become so deeply blurred that it requires both strategic clarity and intelligence and, well, enormous political dexterity to navigate the daily reality.
And it leaves us with the essential question: how can a nation effectively hedge against its most important security partner without completely undermining its own defense? This report is the Danish answer, and it reveals that the dynamic between alliance obligations and national sovereignty is more complex and fragile than ever before. There is clearly much more to explore in this strategic tension.